how I came to write this book and why I wrote it. And then, we'll leave all the rest of the time for questions and answers. But essentially, Bells of Liberty is an attempt to tell the story of the role of Bennett College women in the movement that took place beginning in 1960 with the sit-ins. And because I was uniquely positioned to write this book, and I felt very strongly that it was on me to do it. And that was because I was a participant in the sit-ins, and I was also the niece of the president of Bennett College at that time. And so I kind of had an insider view of a lot of things. And I was also a writer, and those three things came together. And I thought, there isn't anybody else who can combine all of those qualifications to tell this story, and it's not going to get written really unless I do it. So the year before I retired from Bennett, I decided that I wanted to do this as a legacy of mine to leave behind for the college. And that's how it happened. It took me about a year and a half, really, to actually complete it. About a year to do the research and gather everything. But it was important to me, very important to do it. It was important to have a record of how it happened, and for those people who were not there, and who wouldn't have the story except for the media interpretation. And the media kind of latched on to the four guys who went downtown, and that was the way they told the story. And I don't judge them for telling the story this way, because it was simple and it was dramatic, but it wasn't all true. And so I wanted to, in some ways, not correct so much as add to the history of the period and of what happened with us. And so when we get into the questions that you want to ask, we'll talk about specifically what happened and how did it happen. So that's my kind of like, little introduction to what you're going to be asking me.
Well, thank you. You've actually answered a couple of my questions already. I was really interested in your research process, which you spoke about a little bit, but I mean, you say it only took you a year to do the research, and that's amazing to me because of all of the research that it seems like went into this book.
Well, the college gave me a leave of absence, so I didn't. it wasn't a leave. It was like I was a writer in residence for a year, so I didn't have to teach that year, and so I could devote the whole time to doing this. And essentially, the process was, well, going to the archives at the college, and getting everything I could get from that, going to the archives in the Greensboro Public Library, which was interesting and a little bit disturbing because I hope this has been rectified. But a lot of the historical newspaper articles of this period were kind of clipped and put in a folder like I do at home.
Oh, yikes.
Yes, and that's right. And they were in manila folders in a file cabinet. And I said, I'm looking for information on the civil rights movement and the 1960 sit-ins. And so someone pointed me to the file cabinet, and she said, they're in there. And I thought, you're not going to give me any white gloves or anything. And she just left me with these articles. And I thought, it's a good thing I'm an honest person, because I could really just take this home.
Yeah. Wow.
I do hope that things have gotten better, in terms of how the library takes care of.
I hope so too. I'm sorry to hear about that.
So many, and because Greensboro's sit-ins are very important historically. They're important nationally. This puts Greensboro on the map in a way that this needs to be preserved. And, that was one of the main reasons I was writing this book, because I thought this story of Bennett women sitting in and going to jail is going to get lost.
Yeah.
Okay, so that I went to the library, I went to the Bennett archives, and I went to the News and Record.
Mm-hmm.
And they had this wonderful library of photographs. And there was a woman there who I think has passed away since then, a wonderful woman who allowed me to come into the archives, and she said, so tell me what period you're looking for and all this. And I was able to, make copies of these. And as long as I gave credit in the book that they came from the News and Record,
Mm-hmm.
that was fine. So there were those three major sources that were extremely helpful, in addition to sending out, about 200 and some surveys to the Bennett graduates, everybody who graduated between 1958 and 1964. And I sent a questionnaire and asked them if they would write something about what they remembered. And that's what you were referring to in the end of the book. So it was a labor of love.
Oh, yeah.
It was very time consuming, you're right. And there were some really good helpful resources like Civilities and Civil Rights, that wonderful book, which really kind of had everything in one place. That was very useful. And there are other sources that I listed in the back.
Yeah. I personally learned a lot from reading your book. I'm from Greensboro, but there was so much, not even specifically about Bennett or about the sit-ins, just about Greensboro in general, that I had never heard of, which I loved. It's a great experience to be able to sit down with a book and just like really learn from it. But I wonder, was there anything that you learned in your research that really surprised you? Because I was surprised by a lot of the stuff that I read in your book.
That surprised me. Really, not very much. No, because you have to remember I was involved,
Right?
And I was here for 4 years, going to college, and and there were people that I knew that had that kind of, not only did I know them, but they talked about it, and so I can't think of anything that was really a surprise. There were things that I didn't know for sure, but not a surprise.
Okay. You don't write about yourself in the book. You keep a very sort of like distanced from it, which I think comes from being a researcher and a scholar. You don't want to, imbue the manuscript with your own biases. But I'm curious about how your early life, you're from Ohio, is that right?
That's right.
And how did that differ from your experiences in North Carolina? I feel like there's a perception of race relations being different or better in the North versus the South. And I wonder what your experiences were with that.
Well, I went to elementary school and high school in Akron, Ohio. And both of those schools were heavily and predominantly white. And very few Black students. And I had no Black teachers until I got to Bennett College. But the racism in Ohio and in the North, while it manifests in different ways, it's still there.
Right.
And and not only that, but I grew up in a family which was very sophisticated about racism. My father was an executive with the Urban League and worked his whole life in social justice issues. So these things were talked about at the dining room table, and I knew exactly what Northern racism looked like.
Mhm.
And so also my older sisters both went to Bennett College, which meant that we would take family trips to North Carolina to drop them off at the beginning of the semester and pick them up at the end of the semester. And so I had come to the South. My mother was born in Jackson, Mississippi. We knew all about what was going on.
Yeah.
And so it really, in the sense that the laws, the segregation of the South, it was different in the North. You could technically go anywhere you wanted to go and eat in restaurants and go to the movies. And it's technical too, because some restaurants, would say, well, we don't have any seats left, or this apartment has already been rented. So that's what I mean when I say the racism looked different, but was very much there.
Right. So can you tell us about your participation in the sit-ins? I'm sure that's what everybody is here to listen to.
Well, it's all in the book.
Yes, it is.
What it was like, I just have this memory of being outside the student union, and I think, and you have to forgive me because it's been a long time ago, and I was only 19 or 20 or something like that, and I was coming from class, and one of my classmates said, "We're going downtown to sit in. Do you want to go?" And I said, "Sure, I'll go." And somebody was driving, and I have no idea who was driving at the time. It certainly wasn't a Bennett student, because we weren't allowed to have cars, and we really weren't supposed to be riding in cars, I think. But I think that this person was from A&T or something. I don't remember who was driving. I just remember getting in this car and being told that we were going to Woolworths, and and being kind of nervous. We were all kind of nervous, and we did not think of this as a lark or anything like that. We were very serious. I think we had very little idea of how dangerous this could be.
Mhm.
We were not. We were innocent to that dimension of, but we were determined. And I was the one who said, "I think we should pray," and and another one of the young women, who happened to be the kind of leader of the NAACP student chapter, and she said, "We don't need to pray. We just need to go down there." And and I just said my little private prayer, and 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 we headed out, and got there, and because this was either the second or third day, and you'll have to forgive me if I don't remember exactly whether it was the second or third day, but it was early, very early, and there was some organization already, and we were told to go in single file and sit at the counter, and that someone would relieve us in an hour. And so we had our books, and we pretended to read while we were sitting there, and everyone was nervous.
Yeah.
And that was the first day. And then I went back a couple of times to picket. I didn't go back in to sit down, but I did. I walked up and down in front of Woolworths and Crest in a couple of days later. So I have never regretted for a minute that I did that. It was, I wouldn't say it was life changing, but it was life forming
Mm.
in a way. It was putting your body and your principles on the line. That was very important for my maturity. It was important.
Yeah, I'm sure it was life forming. I feel like any sort of experience like that, that's so important and so terrifying. I'm sure, you know, that's got to be something that you keep with you for the rest of your life, and that really influences, you know.
And it strengthens.
Yes.
Somebody in the chat says, can you talk about the planning of the sit-ins? The planning of the sit-ins started the fall before that February 1. It started in October or November before it actually happened. And essentially, because I was not an active member of the NAACP chapter, I didn't go to these planning meetings, but they were advised by Reverend Hatchett, whose name is in the book, and the story of Reverend Hatchett is in the book. And he was the faculty advisor. Their planning was about strategy and how to train and how to be there and so on. And the young men who eventually, became the Greensboro Four, they were invited, the A&T chapter was invited to come over to the Bennett campus and meet with us. And so it was a kind of a joint planning that went on. Some of those guys were dating a couple of the girls at Bennett. And so they weren't strangers is my point. And that really, what happened was that after the Christmas break, everybody knew that we were going to start this after the Christmas break. They decided, they got tired of waiting, and they decided they were going to go ahead and go on the 1st of February and kind of jump the gun. And that's how they became the Greensboro Four. Mm-hmm. And I think that, because not only does the media deal with it that way, but the Civil Rights Museum tells the story of the guys, planning this and so on, which is not really accurate, because it was from the beginning a collaboration, and it's easier to tell the story. As a writer, I know it's easier. It's easier to tell a very dramatic story if you say, one day that they just decided that they were going to do this. But it wasn't like that.
Right. I came across a lot of mentions of just the A&T4 in my research. And that's a story that I heard growing up in Greensboro. You don't hear about Bennett. How does that make you feel? Is it frustrating to have Bennett's role not acknowledged, or are you excited to be able to tell people about it?
It's frustrating that after all these years,
mm-hmm.
that people are still clinging to that original story.
Yeah.
And that, of course, that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, mm-hmm. because I knew that getting it in print and actually documenting it was going to be very important. And I think it's also testament to the fact that, for the most part, people don't do a great deal of reading. And I don't mean to sound like a snob, but that's kind of the fact, that they don't do a great deal of reading, and they get their information from the media and from word of mouth, mm-hmm. and from stories that are told. And so, the Bennett women are doing the best they can to get this story out. And they were overjoyed that I had written the book, and there it was, and nobody could say we didn't do what we actually did. I must say, I'm trying to think of his name, Ezel Blair. Ezel Blair did give us credit. I mean, he does give us credit now publicly. He's the one who talked the most about the Bennett women and saying we need to correct this. And the sit-in committee in the city, has honored now several of us, including me, at their banquet that they have. So they're trying to make it up to us. But the thing that, it takes generations of people in the collective mindset to change perception. It just does.
Yeah, no, for sure. And now we all know the story and we can pass it on. So hopefully it will come out and people will know about it.
Okay.
I was really struck in your book by the fact that some of the Greensboro Four did acknowledge Bennett's role and then other members did not. So I'm not going to name names. You can read the book if you want to know. But given how central Bennett's role in planning and participating in the sit-ins, was it a surprise to you all to find out that you were sort of being left out of the narrative?
I think we were too busy living. We were college students, from freshmen to seniors. We were trying to graduate. We were trying to go to grad school.
Mm-hmm.
We were from all over the country, and we graduated and left, and got married and had children. And it wasn't like we were sitting in a chair somewhere waiting for people to acknowledge us. And so I think that a lot of people didn't think about it that much.
Mm-hmm.
It was successful. It was done. We were proud of it. And furthermore, there was always underneath a kind of desire not to be seen to be doing infighting, kind of have solidarity with the movement.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, and we didn't get on our high horse about that at all. It was later, after I think most of us had some age on us, and things were happening in the country that had to do with civil rights and
Mm-hmm.
all. And it was like, okay, now for me, it was like, okay, now I'm about to retire. Now I have time to tell this story.
Yeah. You had better things to do before. You didn't have time to worry about it.
I had more pressing things to do, like teach you some of these people that are on the chat list.
Actually, we do have some questions from the chat.
Yeah.
Let's see here. I think the first one is from Gwendolyn. She asked, did the involvement in the protest by the Bennett Bells have any impact on their scholarships being in jeopardy of being withdrawn? Also, how did the parents of the Bennett Bells respond to their daughter's involvement?
I think the first question is no. It did not have impact on their scholarships because as most of you know, I was the niece of the president, and she was very much with us and very much supportive of us, and would not have allowed that to happen if she had any control over that at all. That would not have happened. And so that's in the first place. Oh, but the parents, there was a varied reaction. Some of my classmates did not tell their parents until it was all over. Some of them, would go downtown and march, and they would get arrested, and then they would tell their parents. But they wouldn't mention it for fear their parents would just say, no, you can't do that, it's too dangerous, or, Some of them did tell their parents, and their parents were very supportive. My parents were very supportive. They were worried, but that in my family, people, that's kind of what they expected me to do. I mean, that was not unexpected in my family, and I had a kind of checkered response from the people that I interviewed.
Mhm.
Some parents were horrified, and some parents were extremely supportive, and everything in between.
Mhm. And then from Nicole, we have a question about Dudley High School. Can you speak to the connection, if any, between Bennett and Dudley High School during this era?
Dudley High School students became deeply involved, particularly after the Bennett women went home for the summer, and they helped. Excuse me, the Bennett women who were from Greensboro were, of course, here in the city, and they continued the movement, but they were joined by some of the Dudley students, and those students were very important to keeping the momentum going. Because, as I said, there were a lot of Bennett women who were from other states, and they weren't here. And so, yeah, the connection had to do with the organizers, and by that time, adults who had gotten involved, and churches who had gotten involved in their leadership. And so I don't know the names of people that were at Dudley, but I do know that there was significant involvement, and there was significant support from many adults in the Black community in Greensboro.
Let's see here. Until escalated events in recent years, many believed that former generations were somehow built or ready for activism, and today's youth are not. How did Bennett or your elders prepare you for activism? And what advice do you have for today's young people who want to affect change? I had that same question, so.
Well, I feel like saying, because Philippa is one of my dear students, I feel like saying, well, Philippa, probably laughing. I think my parents readied me for activism philosophically. That what I learned from my parents was values, and what I learned from my parents was tolerance and acceptance, and the human values that would somehow say you need to walk the talk, and I felt like my dad in particular was a great role model for that. And though when I was a child in the 40s and 50s, there was not a movement per se that was going on. But my father was in Akron, Ohio, a very, very visible Black leader. That phrase, Black leader, whatever that means, I mean, he was the one that the mayor would call if there was something going on in the Black community that, they wanted advice about. My father and probably several other people, Black ministers and educators, but his involvement in liberation for Black people with the Urban League, you kind of, when you're little and you sit at the dinner table and you kind of take this stuff in by osmosis, and it's like, oh, that's what my parents believe, and that's what we're supposed to do, and and then I learned all that from them, and then I went to Bennett College, where my mother's sister was the president, and I learned some more about that and about Black history. So that was a real philosophical and principled readiness that I had. So I think all that was like foundational, and my advice is to understand that making change is difficult. Making change is risky, and important. And I was never so proud as to see all of them in the streets for Black Lives Matter. I mean, I just cried and cried because it was like, there I am again. I mean, that we're still able to do that. And there was a time in between when some of my Bennett students, when I was teaching in the 90s, would say, well, you could do that, Dr. Brown, but young people now don't believe that. They don't believe that they should get out there, and it's every man for himself, and so on and so on. And we don't know how you all did that, but no, that would not happen. That's what they said. That would not happen now. And and what it took for it to happen was a catalyst. Mm-hmm. And so it isn't true that that would not happen. But I think today's young people are going to carry this standard forward for us, and I'm very happy about that.
Does it feel as though the same fights are being fought today, in your opinion, or do you think there's been progress since you were protesting versus the protests now?
Yeah, I think that part of the reason that it looks so scary now is that there's been progress, and progress of the white establishment is terrified of the progress. And and there's been progress or change on many fronts. And with the election of President Obama, it was like, okay, they went to the barricades, you know what I'm saying? I think that the change is inevitable, and I think that it is only a matter of time until there's a kind of sea change in the culture, and we won't have to do quite so much anymore. But change threatens the status quo, and the level of change is such that, I mean, all you have to do is look on the street at all the mixed couples. When I was young, that was unusual. That was something people stared at. Now it's like ho hum. And there's mixed couples, and not only that, but there was a president, for goodness sake.
Right.
Senators and Congress people and all kinds of, and so the more it gets in your face, if you are afraid of losing your white power and influence, the more scared you're going to get. Mm-hmm. And so the pushback is harder now because the change is in your face.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. So Dolores Lawrence has a question about the Operation Door Knock project.
Okay.
Were you part of that project?
Yes. Yes. I have. Is it a particular question or just anything?
Oh, the question was, were you part of the project?
Yes, I was. I knocked on doors. It was a very eye-opening project. It was eye-opening to me personally, mm-hmm. because we went into some very poor neighborhoods in North Greensboro, mm-hmm. and into situations that, being kind of middle-class, sheltered child of educated parents, I had never seen people living like that. And it was highly educational for me. It was very important to me to understand, okay, this is why we need to do this. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a very exciting project. Yeah.
Operation Door Knock, for those of you who haven't read the book, it was a huge voter registration drive. Correct me if I'm wrong. I was really struck by that too, because I feel like that must have been scary for the reasons that you mentioned, walking up to someone's door and just knocking on it, especially during that time. That It
wasn't actually scary. We went in pairs. I don't remember who went with me. we always did things at Bennett in pairs. We had groups of 3 or groups of 4. But yeah, it wasn't scary. It was in the daytime, and it was in some ways, that time, though, it seems like, when you read about all this, it seems like it might have been frightening. It was really more frightening now, maybe because of all the guns that are out there. And this, but at the time, we didn't think anything of it. We were just going into Black neighborhoods and asking people if they had voted, or if they had registered. It was registration we were doing. Yeah.
Was there pushback against the white establishment in Greensboro about this voter registration you were doing?
Not that I know about.
Okay.
I didn't hear anything about it.
Okay.
It could have been. And as you know, because you read the book, there was certainly pushback about the sit-ins and about integration and about pressure on my aunt to pull us out of jail and to make us stop doing what we were doing, but she was not about to do.
Yeah. I have a lot of questions about Dr. Willa Player. She seems like such a formidable, amazing woman. She really seemed to support everything you were doing, which was unusual at the time. And she allowed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to come to campus to speak at Bennett when other area colleges wouldn't let him speak.
Right.
So can you just speak a little bit about her influence, because she seems like such an important part of this movement?
She had a great influence on everyone who came to Bennett at that time, not just on me, but on all the students whose lives she touched. And if you didn't know her, she was soft-spoken, she was elegant, she was very, very refined, but kind of like Steel Magnolia. I mean, like she did not suffer fools gladly. And, and so underneath that Southern refinement was this will of iron. She taught me a whole lot about life. And I used to say it was my mother taught me how to be a good wife and mother, and my aunt taught me how to be a professional woman. And I had the best of both worlds, because I lived in the president's house for 3 of my 4 years, and I watched her. And, for young people, there's nothing like watching the master. You just kind of take it in.
Yeah.
And so I learned a tremendous amount. She was very influential. And if you talk to anybody who graduated during that time, you'll get the same response. They're still in awe of her.
I know this is sort of an impossible question for you to answer because you're not omniscient. But do you think that if this sort of movement this sit-in movement had happened at a different college that didn't have a Dr. Willa Player figure, do you think it would have been as successful without the support of her?
Well, that's hard to say. As you say, I don't know. There's a lot of chemistry that goes into any situation. I think the fact that she was a woman head of a school for women was a very important thing, and that she understood us not just as students, but as young women, and what we needed, and all of that, and the kind of support that we needed. Her going into the jail to see the girls and to tell them not to worry, that they were not going to get expelled. And, I mean, I have no idea what would happen with other leadership. I just know that that was perfect timing for that time and place for us.
Yeah. You speak about how the students stayed in jail after being arrested during the sit-ins as a quote point of honor. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that.
Well, it was to put pressure on the city to open the public accommodations. And, you know, at the time that I was describing that, the city was holding out on, you know, integrating, certain businessmen were holding out on integrating, and the jails and the holding venues were getting filled up, and they were so full that they were kind of like having a rotating thing where people would, you know, they would arrest more people, and then there would be another demonstration, and they would arrest some more people, and they didn't have anywhere to put them. And so they kept expecting us to give in, you know, that we would give in. And so the Bennett women were like, we're not giving in until you make this necessary change. So it was about, they didn't want to go home because then their leverage would have been weaker. You know, it was like they were there to make a statement, to make a point, to say, until you treat us like full citizens, we're not going anywhere.
All right. You write about how the students who participated were unaware that they were doing something that was going to change the course of history. When was there, or was there ever a sense that you were doing something so historically significant?
You know, it kind of filtered in. It's kind of like, once we had done this, and once we realized that this wasn't just Greensboro, but this was going across the whole country, and watching the television news and all that, I think that then it begins to you know, take its place with you, with history, that, hey, wait a minute, we were part of something, you know, very important. At the time, we knew a little bit about what was going on, and that it was time for us to do something. You know, it's kind of like any movement is like that. You know, some young people here in Greensboro might say, everybody's going downtown to do Black Lives Matter. Are you coming? You know, and at the time you might not have a clue how important and how national this is, but it's local for you at the time. And I think that awareness began to creep in slowly, probably much more after folks got home for the summer and then realized that, oh, this is going on from coast to coast. You know?
So you speak about the perceptions of Greensboro and how the perceptions of Greensboro varied so wildly. Some people thought it was a progressive liberal city, while others thought it was nice and nasty. So like outwardly nice, but inwardly not. How did you and other Bennett students view Greensboro before and after the sit-ins?
First of all, I'd have to say, did we think about Greensboro at all? I mean, I think we thought about, you know, our classmates. We thought about Bennett and A&T. We thought about our lives, and thinking about this. The city itself was not separate from white America. The city was just another city in America that discriminated against Black people. So there was no surprise that this was the way it was. All of us knew about Jim Crow. All of us knew firsthand about this. So yeah, I mean, I think it is the adults really that I read interviews that the adults who said Greensboro has two faces. It is the face of the progressive white liberal, and then it is the face of the reactionary racist who wants to keep things the way they were 100 years ago. And both of those exist in Greensboro. But you know, when you think about it, that's true. That's true across the country.
Right.
And so Greensboro in particular was interesting in that it was not a city where you could expect overt violence and Klansmen walking down the street in uniforms and so on. That they would not have tolerated, but they didn't want to really change.
Right.
They wanted this facade of niceness and that we were civilized in Greensboro, and that's not the way we do things, that kind of statement, you know. But when the adults like Dr. Hobart Jarrett and Dr. Tarpley and these people who were in positions of influence, Black men, who were actually in a position to deal with the city fathers on some issues, they knew exactly what the real deal was with Greensboro.
Yeah.
And how difficult it was to integrate. And so, yeah, it wasn't, we really didn't much think about that as students, you know. There's some new, wait a minute, questions. Oh, there's a new question there.
Mm-hmm. How did Bennett's participation in the sit-ins and the social justice movement affect the school as a private institution compared to NCA&T, which is public?
Right. It was less, well, there was, it's hard to say because I can't ask her, but there was overt pressure on North Carolina A&T because it was a state school and the state funds were tied up in North Carolina A&T. And so there was pressure on the president of A&T to pull the young A&T people out of jail. And he caved to that pressure. Whereas at Bennett, as a private institution, that was heavily supported by the Northern Methodist Church, not the Southern Methodist Church. And at that time, they were pretty much separate. But the Northern Methodists gave a lot of support, financial support to Bennett. And so my aunt's job was never in question. She was never threatened with losing her job. And there was less national pressure on her. In terms of the state, see, because the state had no say-so in what happened at Bennett. So they didn't really even try, except the city of Greensboro, you know, the mayor tried and other people. But that didn't affect what she decided to do.
I hadn't considered that. That's a great question and a great point about the funding, how you're able to sort of operate independently being a private university.
Right.
Yeah. You speak about how there is a national habit of overlooking Black female civil rights leaders, which I agree with. But I wonder if you think that we've as a society gotten better about that, or?
Well, clearly we've gotten better. We have a vice president now, so.
That's right.
Yeah, we've gotten better. But if you look at the history of the civil rights movement, it's very clear that that kind of patriarchal attitude was very much alive and now has become part of the far right and the patriarchal attitude, and that the pushback from the left and the pushback from the liberal side and so on is we're not going to put up with that anymore. So yeah, that and that is really part of this story. You know, that is more than part of this story, that, you know, the boys did it as if we didn't do it, and as if 250 some Bennett women didn't go to jail.
Right. Right. Well, we only have a few more minutes, so if anybody has questions, please put them in. I don't want anyone to feel left out. But I do want to ask you, you are an activist, you are identified as an activist. Are there any causes that are near to your heart that you would like to bring more attention to?
Well, I've been doing, since I retired, I've been doing a lot of freelance teaching.
Mhm.
And I have a very deep spiritual life. And so I think the things that I'm most passionate about are human rights and spirituality. So I've been teaching courses in the divine feminine and how to understand spirit as feminine. I have recently developed a seminar in patriarchy and taught that. And I'm also, especially since the murder of George Floyd, I've been in demand as a teacher of anti-racism and have taught, let's see how many, I don't know how many seminars. In the last year, I would say maybe 6 seminars in anti-racism training. And at the present time, as I think I mentioned to you, I'm working with Holy Trinity Episcopal Church in their effort to do an anti-racism initiative. So I'm busier than I probably want to be as as a retired professor, but that's where my heart is, you know, and I love teaching, so it's fine.
Yeah.
But yeah, teaching spirituality, and I'm working with an organization called Space for Conscious Living, which sponsors retreats and classes and so on. And people can look that up if they want to. Space for Conscious Living, it's online. Also, you said something about if you wanted to know more about my work. I have a website. So if you just Google me, it'll come up. So.
Is there a particular anti-racism curriculum that you're using, or have you developed your own?
It's one that I developed, yes.
Oh, wow. Okay. Do you have any resources that you are particularly fond of? I'm just curious myself.
Well, there's some wonderful books being written lately, particularly by young Black scholars who are just impossibly brilliant. Ibram Kendi's book,
Yeah.
How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Stamped from the Beginning, which is his like 500-page tome on racism. And I'm using here it is, Becoming an Anti-Racist Church by Joseph Brandt, which is a really wonderful book for people who want to work on in-house racism in their churches. So, you know, and every day something else is published. That's one.
Yeah. No, it's been great. I mean, it's a great time for all of this, and I'm so glad to hear you are doing this. And I'm sure it's exhausting, but it's such a worthwhile pursuit.
Yeah, so. And I'm working on a sequel to Black Angels. Yeah, which is about the Reconstruction era in America, which is it's like a dead zone. People don't know about the Reconstruction era. So I'm trying to get that book out there published.
Great.
So I'm like, my son says, you're the busiest grandmother I ever heard of. So,
yeah, you're not retired. Speaking of Black Angels, though, we do have a book club set of this. So if anyone is interested in doing their own sort of book club, the McGirt Horton Book Club has read that book and they enjoyed it. I recommend it. We have book club sets of that and of Bells of Liberty. So check it out. They're both great.
Okay. Thank
I'm
you.
so glad to hear you're writing a sequel. That's great. Thank you. I'm excited to hear about that.
All right. Well,
And yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
thank you. And I just want to shout out for my dear former students. That's wonderful.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Brown.
You take care. Thank you.
You too. Have a good night.